In April 2018, law enforcement officials stepped to a podium in Sacramento to announce they had finally captured the Golden State Killer. True crime conditioning trains us to crave this exact moment. We expect the terrifying aliases, the decades of dead ends, and the final, satisfying click of handcuffs to tie the narrative together. We even have a comforting bureaucratic term for the wait. We call it a cold case. The phrase suggests a file sitting quietly in a drawer, sleeping politely while waiting for forensic science to catch up. The problem with that phrase is that cases are only cold to the legal system. To the people who survive them, the trauma is a nervous system on permanent burning standby. If we map out the 40-year history of this case, we see it play out on two parallel tracks. Up on the top track, you have the institutional machinery, investigations that stall, hit dead ends, and freeze in place. Down on the bottom track, you have the survivors. And their timeline never stops. They were forced into a state of anticipatory fear. The law might have paused its search, but their bodies were actively rehearsing for the return of a threat. So what actually happens to a human life when the timeline of survival outpaces the timeline of justice by 4 decades? In the 1970s and 80s, the institutional timeline fractured. Police departments operated within strict county borders. The crimes were treated separately, given separate nicknames, like the East Area Rapist or the original Night Stalker, and the full map of the danger failed to connect. Then comes the detail that turns a failure of communication into a betrayal of trust. Joseph James DeAngelo, the man eventually identified as the killer, was a former police officer. He understood patrol routes, evidence standards, and the blind spots of the agencies chasing him. He used the exact systems designed to protect the public to ensure he stayed hidden. He didn't simply evade authority. He wore its uniform as the camouflage he needed to hunt. Down on the survivor timeline, the threat dismantled the promise of the 1970s California suburbs. These were neighborhoods built on the idea that clipped lawns and bright streetlights kept danger away. Once that illusion broke, survival became a hidden daily labor. It meant checking the deadbolts 3 times every single night. It meant a ringing phone in the middle of the afternoon was no longer a neighbor calling, but a potential threat. Hypervigilance takes over the brain. A floorboard shifting in winter, or a fridge settling its cycle, forces the body to interpret totally normal domestic sounds as immediate lethal danger. Society asked these people to wake up, go to work, and perform daily normalcy inside rooms that had violently betrayed them. The gap between those two timelines didn't close until 2018. Forensic scientists used preserved DNA and investigative genetic genealogy to finally build a path to a suspect. But for the survivors, the news of an arrest didn't deliver instant peace. It triggered validation shock. The sudden announcement disrupted the hard-won coping mechanisms they had spent decades building. The capture itself felt obscene in its banality. The terrifying legend the public had built turned out to be an aging man, mowing his lawn in an ordinary Citrus Heights neighborhood. The media's renewed fascination meant the case was suddenly everywhere again. Survivors couldn't turn on a television or open a newspaper without encountering the details of their own assaults. A named suspect solves the legal mystery, but it also forces the people harmed to publicly relive the worst nights of their lives just to secure a conviction. The case finally arrived at sentencing in 2020. Decades-old evidence cornered DeAngelo into a guilty plea, securing a massive victory for the prosecutors. Yet it arrived as a compromise. Because the statutes of limitations had expired for many of the sexual assaults, the formal legal charges could never reflect the totality of the harm he caused. To bridge that gap, aging victims and their families had to stand in a courtroom and translate 40 years of private pain into the public record. The courtroom was large enough to hold the law, the attorneys, and the offender. It was entirely incapable of refunding the altered marriages, the inherited fear, and the stolen time. True crime culture loves to wrap these stories in the comforting language of closure. We have to throw that word away. Closure is a manufactured comfort for the public, not the people who lived it. The arrest and sentencing did not cure the trauma. They were necessary, painful acts of accountability. Genetic technology provided the breakthrough, but the real weight of this story belongs to the survivors who carried the truth in their bodies while the rest of the world moved on. Justice can eventually lock a perpetrator in a cell, but for the survivors who had to build their own safety in the dark for 40 years, the door of memory always stays open.